Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, let yourself be carried away by the story, and get ready to drift off to sleep in peace. Leave a comment and please subscribe. By the time the first snow fell on a medieval village, a peasant family's winter had, in a very real sense, already been decided. There was no market stocked year-round, no way to simply buy more food when supplies ran low. Only whatever grain, meat, and vegetables the family had successfully grown, gathered, and preserved during the warmer months now sitting in storage, carefully rationed, and watched with quiet anxiety as the weeks of cold stretched on. Surviving winter, for a medieval peasant, was as much a triumph of planning, preservation, and hard-earned practical knowledge as it was a matter of endurance. This is the story of what medieval peasants actually ate to make it through the harshest season of the year, not through myth or modern assumption, but through the evidence of manorial records, archaeological remains, and the surviving accounts of the people who lived it. Chapter 1: The Autumn Race, Preserving the Harvest Before the Frost. Long before the first frost arrived, medieval peasant families were already engaged in an intense and carefully timed race against the calendar, one that would determine, in large part, whether the coming winter would be survivable or genuinely dangerous. Autumn represented the single most critical period of the entire agricultural year for winter food security, a season during which nearly every available hour of daylight and every able-bodied member of a peasant household was devoted to harvesting, processing, and preserving as much food as possible before the growing season's productive capacity disappeared entirely beneath frost and snow. Grain harvest, discussed in greater detail in the following chapters, formed the essential foundation of this autumn preparation, but it represented only one part of a considerably broader and more demanding seasonal effort. Garden vegetables needed to be harvested at precisely the right moment, since leaving root vegetables such as turnips, onions, and cabbages in the ground too long risked frost damage that would render them unsuitable for the extended winter storage upon which a family's later survival would directly depend. Fruit, where a household had access to it, whether from a small orchard, wild foraging, or hedgerow gathering, required its own careful timing and rapid processing, since fresh fruit spoiled quickly and needed to be dried, or in some regions and periods, pressed into preserved forms within a narrow window following harvest. This intensely compressed autumn workload placed enormous physical demands on every member of a peasant household, and memorial records from across medieval Europe consistently reflect this seasonal intensity, documenting increased demands for labor, adjusted work obligations, and the general recognition, embedded within the practical structure of manorial administration itself, that autumn represented an exceptionally demanding period, requiring the fullest possible mobilization of a household's, and often a wider community's, available labor. Children too young to perform heavier agricultural tasks were nonetheless typically drawn into this seasonal effort in whatever capacity their age and ability allowed, whether gathering fallen nuts and fruit, assisting with basic food processing tasks such as sorting or cleaning harvested vegetables, or helping to carry gathered produce back to the household storage areas, reflecting the genuine, all-hands necessity that characterized this critical seasonal period. The underlying stakes driving this intense autumn effort could not have been higher for an ordinary medieval peasant family. Unlike later societies with access to reliable long-distance food transport, refrigeration, and consistent market supply chains capable of moving surplus food from regions of abundance to regions of shortage, a medieval peasant household's entire winter for food depended almost exclusively on what that specific family had successfully grown and preserved with their own labor. During the preceding growing season, a genuinely direct and unforgiving relationship between autumn effort and winter survival that shaped both the practical urgency and the deeply ingrained cultural importance. Medieval rural society placed on successful, thorough harvest and preservation work, themes that will recur throughout the remaining chapters of this narration as we examine the specific foods and preservation techniques that this crucial autumn labor actually produced. Chapter 2: Salting, Smoking, and Drying, Making Meat Last. Among the various food preservation challenges facing a medieval peasant household preparing for winter, meat presented some of the most technically demanding requirements, since fresh meat spoils considerably faster than grain or many preserved vegetables, making effective preservation technique absolutely essential to successfully extending the nutritional value of a household's limited annual meat supply across the many months of winter that inevitably followed. Autumn represented the specific season when this meat preservation challenge became most immediately pressing, since, as discussed in related historical accounts of medieval peasant animal husbandry more broadly, many households made the deliberate and practically necessary decision to slaughter a portion of their livestock specifically during this season, a choice driven by the simple and unavoidable reality that maintaining a full complement of animals through an entire winter required a quantity of stored fodder that most ordinary peasant households simply could not reliably provide. This autumn slaughter, sometimes referred to by later historians using a term borrowed from other European languages describing this seasonal practice, produced a sudden, significant quantity of fresh meat that needed immediate and effective preservation to avoid substantial, wasteful spoilage. Salting represented the single most widespread and reliable meat preservation technique available to medieval peasant households, relying on salt's genuinely effective ability to draw moisture out of meat tissue, creating an environment considerably less hospitable to the bacterial growth responsible for spoilage. This process required a meaningful quantity of salt, a resource that, while not among the most expensive commodities available in medieval markets, nonetheless represented a genuine, ongoing household expense that needed to be carefully budgeted for as part of a family's broader winter preparation. Planning, with salt typically acquired through trade or purchase rather than produced directly by most ordinary peasant households themselves, since salt production required specific geographic access to coastal salt evaporation sites or inland salt springs and mines that most rural peasant communities did not directly possess. Smoking provided a complementary and, in many regions, equally important preservation technique, typically involving hanging prepared strips or cuts of meat within or above a household's hearth, allowing the combination of heat and smoke exposure to further reduce moisture content while also imparting genuine antimicrobial properties from the wood's smoke itself, a practical benefit medieval people clearly understood through direct empirical experience, even without any scientific understanding of the specific chemical compounds responsible for this effect. Drying, whether applied independently or in combination with salting and smoking, represented a further important preservation strategy, particularly effective in regions and specific weather conditions, allowing meat to be hung and air-dried successfully without excessive spoilage risk during drying process itself. Through this combination of techniques, applied according to local tradition, available resources, and specific regional climate conditions, medieval peasant households transformed a limited, seasonally concentrated autumn meat supply into a more gradually consumable resource capable of providing meaningful, if carefully rationed, nutritional supplementation to the household's winter diet across the many months separating one year's harvest from the next. Chapter 3: Grain, Bread, and the Winter Loaf. Grain stood at the absolute center of the medieval peasant winter diet, providing the essential caloric foundation upon which nearly every other food discussed Throughout, this narration served as a supplement, rather than a genuine alternative, an understanding how grain was harvested, stored, transformed into bread throughout the winter months reveals one of the most fundamental and practically important dimensions of medieval rural survival. The specific grains cultivated and consumed varied meaningfully by region and local growing conditions, but commonly included wheat, rye, barley, and oats, with peasant households frequently growing and consuming a mixture of these grains, rather than relying exclusively on a single variety. Practical strategy that provided a degree of genuine agricultural risk management, since different grains carried somewhat different tolerances for weather conditions, soil quality, and disease, meaning a household growing multiple grain varieties maintained better overall protection against possibility that any single crop failure might completely eliminate their grain supply for the coming year. It is worth noting, as related historical accounts of medieval peasant nutrition have similarly observed, that wheat, generally considered the most desirable and highest value grain within medieval society, was frequently sold or paid to the manorial lord as rent or tax obligation rather than consumed directly by the peasant household that had grown it, meaning ordinary peasant bread was typically made from coarser, darker grains such as rye or barley, or from mixed grain flour blends, rather than from the finer wheat bread reserved primarily for wealthier households and the nobility. Proper grain storage represented an absolutely critical winter preparation task, since improperly stored grain faced genuine risk of spoilage from moisture, and significant loss from rodents and other pests capable of destroying a meaningful portion of a household's entire winter food supply. Storage conditions were inadequate. Peasant households typically stored grain in sealed containers, woven baskets, or dedicated storage structures specifically designed to minimize these risks, with archaeological evidence from numerous medieval sites confirming the widespread use of purpose-built storage pits and structures. Reflecting the genuine practical importance medieval communities placed on protecting this essential winter resource. Bread making itself represented an ongoing, essential domestic task throughout the winter months, though the specific process varied depending on a household's available resources and local custom. Many medieval peasant households did not possess their own private oven, since manorial lords frequently held exclusive legal rights over baking ovens within their territory, a system requiring peasants to pay a fee for the right to bake bread at the lord's communal oven, rather than constructing, using a private oven of their own, an arrangement similar to the mill monopolies discussed in related historical accounts of medieval manorial obligations that added yet another layer of financial obligation to the already demanding economic pressures facing an ordinary peasant household. The resulting bread, whatever specific grain or combination of grains it contained, formed the genuine dietary backbone of the medieval peasant winter table, typically consumed at nearly every meal throughout the season, and frequently serving, as the farling chakterexponas, as the direct component within the era's most common and essential daily meal. Chapter 4: Root Vegetables and the Underground Larder. While grain provided the essential caloric foundation of the medieval peasant winter diet, root vegetables offered a genuinely important supplementary food source, valued specifically for their capacity to survive extended winter storage, considerably better than most other fresh produce a peasant household might otherwise have access to, and understanding the specific vegetables grown and how they were stored reveals an important practical dimension of medieval winter food security. Turnips represented one of the most widely cultivated and consumed root vegetables across much of medieval Europe, valued for their genuine versatility, reasonable ease of cultivation, and critically, their capacity to store successfully for extended periods under appropriately cool, dry, conditions, making them a particularly valuable winter food resource for ordinary peasant households working with genuinely limited storage capacity and resources. Onions and garlic similarly played a significant role within the medieval peasant windhunter larder, valued both for their direct nutritional contribution and for their practical culinary function in adding flavor to the otherwise frequently plain, grain-based dishes that formed the bulk of the medieval peasant winter diet, a genuinely important consideration given how limited and repetitive the available range of winter food options often was for an ordinary rural household. Cabbages, along with related leafy vegetables cultivated within a household's small garden plot, provided another significant winter vegetable resource. And while fresh cabbage itself required relatively prompt consumption or specific preservation technique to avoid spoilage, some medieval communities, particularly in certain regions of northern and eastern Europe, developed fermentation-based preservation methods allowing cabbage to be converted into a longer-lasting preserved form, extending its usable storage life considerably beyond what fresh cabbage alone could achieve, though. The specific prevalence and regional distribution of these particular fermentation techniques during the medieval period specifically remains a topic where historical evidence is somewhat less complete and consistent compared to the better documented practices
of salting and grain storage discussed elsewhere in this narration. The practical storage of these various root vegetables typically relied on cool, dark storage conditions specifically intended to slow the natural processes of decay and sprouting that would otherwise progressively reduce a stored vegetable's nutritional value and eventual edibility over the course of an extended winter storage period. Many medieval peasant households constructed or maintained dedicated storage pits, root cellars, or specifically designated cool sections within their existing home or associated outbuildings, taking practical advantage of the naturally insulating properties of earth itself to help maintain consistently cool storage temperatures throughout the winter months, regardless of surface weather conditions, a genuinely effective practical storage strategy that archaeological excavations at numerous medieval rural sites have confirmed through the discovery of purpose-built storage pit features closely associated with peasant household remains, providing direct physical evidence of this important, if relatively modest and easily overlooked, dimension of medieval winter food security planning. Chapter 5: Pottage, the daily meal that carried a family through winter. If any single dish deserves recognition as the defining meal of medieval peasant winter survival, it is pottage, a thick soup or stew that, in one form or another, likely constituted the single most frequently consumed meal across the entire medieval peasant world throughout the winter months, and understanding this humble but genuinely essential dish reveals a great deal about how medieval households successfully combined their various stored winter food resources into a practical, sustaining daily meal. At its most basic level, pottage consisted of grain, whether whole, cracked, or ground into a coarse meal, boiled together with whatever combination of vegetables, and when available, small quantities of meat or fat, a household happened to have on hand, slowly simmered over the household hearth. Fire into a thick, warming, and genuinely calorically substantial dish capable of efficiently combining and extending a household's various available food resources into a single practical meal. This basic combination made pottage an extraordinarily practical winter food for several genuinely important reasons. It required minimal specialized preparation equipment. Beyond a simple cooking pot suspended over the hearth fire, it could be prepared using whatever specific combination of grain and vegetables a household actually had available on any given day, rather than requiring a fixed, specific recipe. And it produced a warm meal directly beneficial for combating cold exposure, a genuinely valuable practical benefit during the coldest winter months. The specific composition of a household's pottage varied considerably depending on available resources, time of year, and household wealth, with wealthier households capable of adding more frequent or substantial quantities of meat, better quality grain, and a wider variety of vegetables. Seasoning. While poorer households frequently prepared a considerably plainer version, sometimes consisting of little more than grain and water with minimal additional ingredients, particularly during the leaner late winter period, explored in a later chapter of this narration. This meaningful variation in pottage quality and substance across different economic circumstances reinforces a theme recurring throughout this entire narration, that while the basic practical strategies of medieval winter food survival were broadly shared and understood across the entire peasant population, the actual lived experience and nutritional adequacy of winter eating varied considerably according to a specific household's economic circumstances and available resources. Pottage's practical importance extended beyond simple nutrition into the broader rhythm of medieval peasant daily life, since the ongoing preparation of a household's pottage pot, frequently maintained and continuously replenished over an extended period rather than prepared fresh for each individual meal, represented a genuinely efficient use of limited fuel resources and household labor, allowing a family to maintain a consistently available source of warm, nutritious food throughout the demanding winter months without requiring separate, individually prepared meals at each mealtime. This practical efficiency, combined with pottage's genuine nutritional adequacy when prepared with reasonably sufficient ingredients, helps explain why this relatively simple dish occupied such a central, enduring position within medieval peasant winter foodways across such a broad span of medieval European history and geography.
Chapter 6: Cheese, Butter, and the Preserved Dairy Larder. Dairy products, while representing a smaller overall proportion of the typical medieval peasant winter diet, compared to the grain-based staples discussed in previous chapters, nonetheless played a genuinely valuable supplementary role within many medieval peasant households, particularly those maintaining dairy animals such as cows, goats, or sheep, and understanding how medieval households preserved and utilized dairy resources across the winter months reveals another important dimension of practical medieval food security strategy. Fresh milk itself, given its rapid spoilage without refrigeration, played a genuinely limited direct role within the winter diet specifically, since most dairy animals produced meaningfully reduced milk yields during the winter months. In any case, a natural seasonal pattern connected to the animals' own reduced access to fresh pasture forage during this period. This practical reality meant that the genuine dietary contribution of dairy resources during winter depended considerably more heavily on preserved dairy products, prepared and stored during the more productive spring and summer months when fresh milk was considerably more abundant, than on any meaningful ongoing fresh milk supply available during the winter season itself. Cheese represented the single most important preserved dairy product within the medieval peasant winter larder, valued specifically for its considerably extended storage life compared to fresh milk, allowing a household to convert a seasonally abundant spring and summer milk surplus into a genuinely valuable, long-lasting winter food resource. The specific cheese-making techniques employed varied considerably by region and available household resources, ranging from relatively simple, quickly produced soft cheeses intended for reasonably prompt consumption, to harder, more extensively processed cheese varieties specifically developed and valued for their genuinely extended storage capability, allowing successful preservation across many months of winter storage when properly prepared and maintained under appropriately cool, dry conditions. Butter, similarly produced from surplus spring and summer milk, provided another valuable preserved dairy resource, and while butter itself carried a somewhat shorter practical storage life compared to harder cheese varieties, various preservation techniques, including salting, could meaningfully extend butter's usable storage period, allowing at least a portion of a household's summer dairy surplus to remain available as a valuable source of fat and flavor enhancement for the otherwise frequently plain grain and vegetable-based dishes that dominated the typical medieval peasant winter diet. The genuine value that medieval society placed on these preserved dairy products is further reflected in their frequent appearance within manorial records documenting rents, taxes, and other obligations owed by peasant households to their lord, with cheese and butter both appearing repeatedly across numerous surviving medieval manorial documents as recognized, valuable forms of payment, confirming that these preserved dairy products represented a genuinely significant and economically meaningful component of medieval peasant agricultural production, extending well beyond their direct nutritional value to the households that produced them. Chapter 7, Warm Drink and Winter Thirst. Beverages occupied a genuinely significant place within the medieval peasant winter diet, serving practical functions extending well beyond simple thirst quenching, and understanding what medieval peasants actually drank throughout the winter months reveals important dimensions of both practical nutrition and daily domestic life during this demanding season. Ale stood as the single most common and widely consumed beverage across medieval peasant society, brewed primarily from barley, though other available grains were sometimes used depending on regional availability and household resources. Medieval ale differed considerably from later beer varieties in one particularly important respect relevant to this narration's focus on nutrition and practical survival. Since medieval ale was typically brewed without hops, a preservation and flavoring ingredient that became increasingly common. Only later in the medieval period, and afterward, meaning earlier medieval ale generally possessed a notably shorter storage life compared to later hopped beer, requiring more frequent brewing throughout the year, including during the winter months themselves, rather than allowing for the kind of extended advanced stockpiling possible with grain or preserved meat. The practical importance of ale within the medieval peasant diet extended beyond simple refreshment into genuine nutritional territory, since the brewing process itself provided meaningful caloric content derived from the fermented grain, meaning ale functioned, in a genuine practical sense, as partial food source alongside its role as a beverage, a dual function that made it a genuinely valuable component of the overall winter diet, rather than simply an optional accompaniment to more substantial meals. Additionally, and importantly given the water quality concerns present in many medieval communities, the brewing process involved boiling water as part of ale production, incidentally reducing certain waterborne health risks compared to drinking untreated water directly, a practical benefit medieval people would not have understood in modern scientific terms, but likely recognized empirically through the simple observation that ale consumption was generally associated with better health outcomes compared to drinking from certain less reliable water sources. During the coldest winter periods, specifically, warmed drink took on particular practical importance, with historical evidence and later folk tradition both reflecting the common practice of warming ale, sometimes with the addition of available spices or other flavoring ingredients when a household's resources allowed for such additions, directly over the household hearth fire before consumption, providing genuine direct physical warming benefit alongside the beverage's nutritional and hydrating function, a practical winter adaptation that made intuitive sense to medieval households. Managing the combined challenges of cold exposure and limited available resources, and one that connects directly to the broader pattern discussed throughout this narration of medieval winter survival strategy, consistently prioritizing practical, resourceful adaptations that served multiple beneficial functions simultaneously within a household's genuinely limited overall resource base. Chapter 8: Fasting and the Church Calendar's Grip on the Winter Table. The medieval Christian Church exercised genuine and direct influence over what peasant households actually ate throughout significant portions of the winter calendar, through an extensive system of religiously mandated fasting periods and dietary restrictions that shaped medieval eating patterns in ways requiring careful historical explanation to properly understand, since this religious dimension of medieval winter eating represented far more than a simple, occasional dietary preference, but rather a genuinely binding, socially and religiously enforced structure affecting the entire medieval Christian population, including ordinary peasant households, across substantial portions of the calendar year. Advent, the period of religious preparation preceding Christmas, traditionally involved fasting obligations within medieval Christian practice, meaning the weeks immediately preceding what might otherwise be assumed to represent a purely celebratory winter period actually required peasant households to observe genuine dietary restriction, typically involving abstention from meat and, depending on the specific severity of fasting observance in a given region and period, sometimes additional restrictions on dairy products, as well restrictions that, given the already limited range of available winter foods discussed throughout this narration, meaningfully narrowed an already constrained set of dietary options during a portion of the calendar when household food stores were, in any case, beginning their long, gradual winter depletion. Beyond Advent specifically, the broader medieval Christian calendar mandated weekly fasting observance on Fridays throughout the entire year, along with numerous additional designated fast days and periods scattered throughout the calendar, meaning that medieval peasant households navigated a genuinely complex, recurring pattern of religiously mandated dietary restriction that directly intersected with, and further complicated, the already demanding practical challenge of managing limited winter food resources effectively across an entire season. Fish, notably exempted from the meat restrictions that applied during these fasting periods, took on particular dietary importance, specifically during these religious observances, though access to fish itself varied considerably depending on a household's proximity to rivers, lakes, or coastal areas, meaning inland peasant households without convenient access to fresh fish faced genuinely more difficult practical challenges in successfully observing these fasting requirements compared to households situated near reliable fish sources. Despite these genuine dietary restrictions, it is worth noting that the medieval Christian calendar also incorporated specific feast days and celebratory periods, including Christmas itself, during which normal fasting restrictions were explicitly lifted, and even modest celebratory eating was culturally encouraged and religiously sanctioned, providing peasant households with specific, calendar-anchored occasions for consuming better or more substantial food than their typical daily winter fare allowed, when household resources permitted such celebration. This alternating pattern of religiously mandated restriction and religiously sanctioned celebration, woven throughout the entire winter calendar and beyond, meant that the medieval church's influence over peasant eating extended well beyond simple moral or spiritual guidance into genuinely direct, practical control over the specific timing and composition of ordinary household meals throughout significant portions of the year. A dimension of medieval peasant winter life that modern audiences, accustomed to eating patterns determined almost entirely by personal preference and practical availability rather than religious calendar obligation, can easily underestimate or overlook entirely. Chapter 9: The Lean Months, Late Winter and the Hungry Gap. As winter progressed toward its final weeks and the calendar approached the arrival of spring, medieval peasant households across much of Europe typically feast their single, most difficult, and precarious period of dietary scarcity, a recurring seasonal challenge that historians studying this period have come to refer to using the descriptive term the hungry gap, and understanding this specific late winter phenomenon reveals an important and genuinely challenging dimension of medieval peasant winter survival that extended well beyond the winter season's coldest months alone. The underlying cause of this late winter scarcity followed directly from the practical realities of medieval agricultural timing discussed throughout this narration. By late winter, a household stored food supplies accumulated during the previous autumn's harvest and carefully rationed across the intervening months had typically been substantially depleted, while the new growing season's earliest potential food sources, whether newly planted crops or the earliest wild plants beginning to emerge with the arrival of spring, remained weeks or even months away from actually providing usable, harvestable food. This created a genuinely difficult seasonal gap, during which a household's accumulated winter stores had largely run their course, while the new agricultural year's productive capacity had not yet begun to meaningfully replace them. A precarious period of dietary vulnerability that affected medieval peasant communities across an enormous geographic range, though the specific severity and timing of this hungry gap period varied considerably depending on regional climate, the success or failure of the preceding year's harvest, and a given household's specific economic circumstances and stored resource management throughout the preceding months. During this genuinely challenging period, peasant households frequently relied on whatever remaining food resources could still be accessed or improvised, including the final, carefully rationed remnants of stored grain, increasingly thin and less substantial pottage prepared with whatever limited ingredients remained available, and in many regions, early foraged wild plants that began emerging even before formal spring planting could take place, providing a genuinely valuable, if limited, supplementary food source during this specific seasonal window of scarcity. Historical and archaeological evidence, including the skeletal indicators of periodic nutritional stress discussed in related historical accounts of medieval peasant health, suggests that this late winter hunter hungry gap period represented a genuine, recurring annual challenge affecting medieval peasant nutrition and health, rather than an unusual or exceptional crisis limited to specifically severe famine years alone, meaning that even in relatively ordinary years without genuine famine conditions, medieval peasant households likely experienced a predictable, recurring pattern of tightened, reduced nutrition during these specific late winter weeks, a sobering reality that adds important nuance to any complete understanding of medieval peasant winter survival, since even generally successful, well-managed winter preparation could not entirely eliminate this predictable seasonal period of genuine dietary hardship built into the fundamental rhythm of medieval agricultural life itself. Chapter 10: The Lord's Table and the Peasant's Table, a Winter Divide. The specific experience of winter eating within medieval society varied enormously according to social class and economic circumstance, and examining the meaningful contrast between how a manorial lord's household and an ordinary peasant household actually ate throughout the winter months reveals important insight into the broader social and economic inequality that structured medieval rural society more generally, a theme that has recurred throughout this entire narration but deserves specific, direct examination in its own right. A wealthy manorial lord's winter table typically featured considerably greater variety, quantity, and quality of food compared to what an ordinary peasant household could access, reflecting the lord's substantially greater economic resources and, importantly, his position at the top of the manorial system through which peasant labor and agricultural production ultimately flowed upward as rent, tax, and various other feudal obligations discussed in related historical accounts of medieval manorial structure. Fine wheat bread, rather than the coarser rye or mixed grain bread typical of peasant households, regularly appeared on a lord's table, while meat, consumed by peasant households only occasionally, and in modest quantity as previously discussed, featured considerably more prominently and frequently. Within a wealthy household's regular winter diet, often supplemented by game animals such as deer or wild boar obtained through hunting rights that medieval law and custom typically reserved exclusively for the nobility, and specifically excluded ordinary peasants from legally exercising themselves. Imported and specialty food items, including certain spices, dried fruits, and other goods obtained through longer-distance medieval trade networks, appeared with meaningful regularity on wealthy medieval tables, particularly during winter feast occasions connected to the religious calendar. Discussed in the previous chapter, representing an entire category of winter dietary experience, essentially unavailable to ordinary peasant households, whose economic resources rarely extended to purchasing genuinely expensive imported goods, and whose winter diet instead relied almost entirely on locally produced and preserved food resources managed through the household's own direct agricultural labor and storage efforts. This meaningful dietary inequality carried genuine, measurable consequences extending beyond simple culinary variety into actual health and survival outcomes, since the more varied, substantial, and consistently available diet accessible to wealthier medieval households likely provided genuinely superior nutritional adequacy compared to the more limited, repetitive, and seasonally precarious diet typical of ordinary peasant households. A disparity that connects directly to the broader patterns of unequal winter survival vulnerability discussed throughout this narration, particularly regarding the especially severe risks facing the poorest peasant households during genuine famine crisis periods. This social and economic dimension of medieval winter eating, while perhaps unsurprising given the broader, well-documented inequality characterizing medieval feudal society more generally, remains an essential and important context for accurately understanding medieval peasant winter food experience, since the specific challenges, strategies, and genuine hardships explored throughout this entire narration applied with meaningfully different severity and consequence, depending on which side of this significant, persistent medieval social and economic divide a given household actually occupied. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment letting us know what time you watched it and from which country.